Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Museum of Science live program. Every year, our current science and technology team makes their picks for the most exciting, influential, important, and coolest stories from the world of science from the last 12 months. This year has been very different in so many ways, but we still wanted to share our top 10 list with you, which we will be doing all January long. Last week, we kicked off our countdown with an honorable mention story. Didn't quite make the countdown, but our team was delighted to learn that scientists discovered the duck-billed platypus glows in the dark. Our number 10 story was the Atlantic hurricane season of 2020, which broke many records, including the most named storms ever in a single season, 30. And number 9 was the recreation of the voice of a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy using a CT scan and 3D printing. If you missed that live stream, but you're interested in more details, you can watch the replay anytime on our Facebook or YouTube page. In a moment, I'll be joined by 3 of my fellow Museum of Science educators, and we'll continue our countdown today with our picks for number 8, number 7, and number 6. And then each Wednesday in January, we'll be back with a live stream to reveal the next few entries, counting down all the way to our number 1 story of the year, 2 weeks from today. My name is Eric, my pronouns are he, him, and I'll be your moderator during this session, which means I'll be fielding all of the questions that you have for our panelists. Please do begin asking questions about the stories or the process of how we selected them at any time. To ask a question on Zoom, just press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and include your name and age if you'd like a shout out. If you'd like to see captions on Zoom, you can click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and select show captions. And if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, we won't be able to see your questions or comments, but we're really happy you're tuning in. So at this point, I'd like to invite my panelists to turn on their cameras, introduce themselves, and we'll be ready to keep going with our countdown.
Hi, everyone. My name is Becca. My pronouns are she and her. And this is only my second year doing the top 10 science stories, but it is one of my favorite things to do. And I think my favorite thing about this is that we get so many people to come together and collaborate on making a list for what stories made it to the top. So we end up with a variety of interests and a variety of subjects, which I really, really enjoy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I use he, him pronouns, and I love the debate that surrounds all of this. You always walk into the room with stories you think you're really passionate about, and you walk out with completely different stories that you're now really passionate about because you've been convinced that they are far superior in terms of scientific legacy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susan, and I use she, her pronouns, and I have been doing the top 10 since we kind of started it. It was in some form before this, but in 2008 or so. It's always my favorite presentation to do every year because I love that we get to talk about a ton of different science topics all in a very short period of time. And my highlight was when a few years ago, all the power went out on the stage and I had to do all 10 stories from memory. Luckily, it wasn't the first time I was giving it, but it was just really fun to see if I could get through all 10 of them on there. It's a lot of fun to be able to do.
All right, well, our countdown is heating up. Jonathan, can you tell us about our number 8 story of the year?
Absolutely. So our number 8 science story of the year has to do with some pretty exciting science that occurred around our closest planetary neighbor, Venus. So Venus is the second planet from the sun. It's a little bit smaller than Earth, and it may even at one time in the distant past have looked very similar to Earth, but certainly no longer. Today, this is a more contemporary image of Venus and the clouds that surround it. Venus has an incredibly thick, dense, mostly toxic atmosphere, which means that it has gone through a process of runaway greenhouse effect, the runaway greenhouse effect. So it is actually the hottest planet in our solar system, temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And because of that, it's been very difficult to study Venus. And for a long time, we thought there wasn't any possible way that life could exist on Venus. So we haven't thought of many excuses to study it. All of that could potentially be changing in the near future, though, because of a recent discovery that was announced in September of this year. And this was a discovery from researchers using 2 different telescopes to look at Venus, the James Clerk Maxwell telescope in Hawaii and the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in Chile. They were studying the composition of Venus's atmosphere and found a very interesting signature for a compound known as phosphine. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. The first one was that it was discovered not on the surface of Venus, but high up in the atmosphere, where the temperature and the pressure are actually very similar to that on Earth. And the second reason it was so interesting is because on Earth, at least, the presence of phosphine is generally because there is decaying organic matter or decaying living matter. And so that raised this really interesting question: could there potentially be life in the clouds around Venus? Now, this was a really exciting science story when it came out in September. It made a ton of headlines. It even made sort of national news networks. But this is a pretty classic example of extraordinary claims in science require extraordinary evidence. And so immediately when this story came out, researchers began to re-examine the evidence. Even the researchers who had published the report sort of looked back at their initial findings and tried to figure out if there was evidence to further assert that or to refute it. And turns out they may have gotten a little bit too prematurely excited, that those initial phosphine readings were probably a little bit higher. And there are some other reasons why phosphine might be present in the atmosphere, but it's still an interesting story for two reasons. First, it shows the scientific process in action, right? We as scientists, we use evidence to create hypotheses, and then we ask questions to further clarify those hypotheses or confirm or refute them. And it also tells us that there's a lot we still don't understand about Venus, right? Our closest planetary neighbor, and a lot of questions we can continue to ask. And one of those came from a second study about Venus that was published earlier this year, looking at the volcanic activity on the surface. So this is a picture of Venus's surface taken from radar by the Magellan probe, which orbited the planet in the early 1990s. And what it shows us is that the surface of Venus is made up of a ton of lava flows, because Venus used to be incredibly volcanically active. Now, that's not particularly unique. We find that on a lot of planetary bodies. What's much more unique is if a planetary body is volcanically active presently. In fact, only Earth and a moon of Jupiter have been confirmed to be presently volcanically active. That also might be changing, though, based on this study that was published in July on the surface of Venus, where researchers were re-examining some of these volcanic deposits, the corona, the sort of crater-like object that develops around a volcano which has exploded. And they were looking at the different erosion cycles that were occurring around those volcanoes. And what they determined is that some of them appear to be very, very recent eruptions. In fact, perhaps in the last few thousand years, which is, in a geologic sense, just a blink of an eye. So they determined there are as many as 37 volcanoes on the surface of Venus which remain active potentially through today, which would be another really exciting finding, and again, another reason to continue asking questions and exploring Venus.
Yeah, I like both of these stories because they're both open-ended questions. It's not a discovery that's going to make news and then we move on. Both of them need much more research. We need much more observation and evidence before we can say for sure whether we have volcanoes or life. I mean, they're both pretty big claims, especially life on another planet. And we're looking all over the galaxy for life. Having it on the next neighbor over Venus would be really exciting.
Yeah, and one of the things that most excites me about it is the ways it would allow us to creatively explore Venus in the future. One of the reasons we haven't looked for these things before is just how hostile Venus is as an environment. For instance, we study Mars all the time. We send robots to Mars, rovers to Mars, and those rovers have existed for over a decade sometimes, just sort of exploring the Martian surface and bringing back a ton of data. We can't do that with Venus currently because any robotic probe we've sent there has melted within 2 hours. And so it's really going to take us thinking creatively about how we can get sort of these long-term up-close studies of Venus. And these sorts of findings give us the impetus to essentially explore that and think creatively like that.
Again, folks, if you have questions for us on these stories or how we pick them or anything, you can type them in if you're joining on Zoom using that Q&A function, and we'll take them and discuss them. But Becca, I had a question for you. if you wanted to talk about volcanoes, are you more excited about volcanoes on Earth or on Venus? Say if you could go study one up close with a perfectly safe apparatus and a suit and everything, would you go to Venus and study those and be the first one to do it, or would you rather study the Earth ones?
Yeah, that's a tough question because I do love volcanoes, and I love studying them, but I feel like I maybe would want to actually go to study the Venus volcanoes, mainly because we're not entirely sure what's going on under the surface of Venus. We've learned a lot about the Earth. We can study the Earth really well. We're able to go to a lot of our volcanoes. So we know pretty much what's going on below our surface. But on Venus, what's happening? And I think one of my favorite things was sort of that image that Jonathan just shared, showing kind of where those volcanoes might be on Venus and noticing that there's kind of a band across the entire planet where it looks like there might be some activity. So I'd be most interested to wonder what's happening there. What can we discover about Venus's sort of geologic, or well, it's Venus, it's not Earth, but wondering what's going on under the surface of Venus.
And we had a question come in. We mentioned it's really hot, but exactly how hot is the surface of Venus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it averages roughly 800 degrees Fahrenheit or 470 degrees Celsius, but it can get even much more hotter than that during different seasons and things of that nature.
And then one more question from Kayoko. If we're talking about life that might be floating around in an atmosphere, what would that be like? What would we actually be looking for? Like little green people in planes?
That's another great question. And I think that that's what makes this Venus study so interesting. We don't actually know what that life would really look like. And so one of the reasons why it's exciting to find phosphine in the atmosphere is that it is a signature of life here on Earth. And so what we're really interested in is when we look at other planets, what is a guaranteed sign that there might be life? Is it the presence of phosphine? Is it the presence of methane, which we occasionally find on Mars? There are a bunch of different compounds that exist in our atmosphere because there's life on Earth, but we're not sure if they're necessary or if they would be present in around other planets that also had life.
Okay. Well, it's time to move on to our number 7 story this year, which certainly made a big splash in the paleontology world. Becca, this is probably your favorite story of the year. Can you give us the details?
It certainly is my favorite story of the year. I've been incredibly excited about it ever since I heard it was going to be published, and I started preparing for that. As much as I love talking about volcanoes, I don't know, I might like talking about dinosaurs slightly more. Now, this story that came out in April of 2020 is all about the Spinosaurus. Now, the Spinosaurus made headlines, well, a long time ago in the early 1900s when it was first discovered, but it kind of got a little bit lost because there was only one example of a Spinosaurus fossil, and unfortunately it was lost during World War II. But in 2014, we learned a little bit more about the Spinosaurus, and so we got a little bit more of the image that perhaps you've seen in one of my favorite movie franchises. And it looked a little bit more like this, kind of like a T-Rex with a spine on its back and maybe possibly could swim. Well, this year we discovered that it probably did swim. Scientists were able to discover an entirely new set of fossils, and that was really exciting because it was another sample that they could go off of. But this set of fossils that they discovered in Morocco was even more exciting because they were able to find approximately 80% of a tail. Now, 80%, although not a complete tail, is, well, almost a complete tail. And it gave them a really good understanding of what that tail looked like and how maybe it attached to the rest of the body. So this tail was really important because it gave scientists an understanding of what Spinosaurus probably actually looked like. It looked a little bit more crocodilian than T-Rex, and it had this sort of long tadpole-like tail that may have been able to move through water. but they weren't entirely sure. So they were able to test it out by 3D printing this tail and attaching it to an apparatus. Then they were able to have water go through this entire structure, and they could test how easily this shape of the tail could go through the water, something they called thrust, the ability for the tail to move through the water easily. And they compared it to two dinosaur tails that were entirely land dinosaurs, didn't go in the water, couldn't swim. Then they also compared it to two aquatic animal tails that live today to see how this tail did. And it was actually performing pretty well through the water. In fact, this Spinosaurus tail did about 8 times better than the two land dinosaur tails. So it definitely could move through the water, but it did about 2 times worse than the entirely aquatic animals, meaning that the Spinosaurus was probably a semi-aquatic dinosaur, one that could definitely swim, spend quite a bit of time in the water, but also probably spent some time on land, taking advantage of food resources all around. Now, this was so exciting for me and for a lot of other people because this is the first swimming dinosaur that we know of. And so we are excited to learn a little bit more about how it behaved and a lot of other ways that it was able to use its ability to swim.
Yeah, I love so much about the story, especially the use of technology to enhance our understanding of something from long ago. We've already seen it in kind of a theme this year in our top 10 of using technology to learn more than we could otherwise. But for 100 years, studying dinosaurs was looking at their fossils and making predictions and trying to gather evidence about what that animal was like in life. And that was kind of it. You just had to go find a better fossil if you wanted to change your idea. And now, the last couple of years, we've had so many stories about recreating an animal in life based on the fossil and seeing how it moved or how it swam or being able to get just more evidence. It's been really cool.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll continue.
I think one of my favorite things about this story is that how Becca was talking about that we didn't know a lot about swimming dinosaurs. And it answered one of the really big questions in this area was that there were all of these apex predators, meaning top of the food chain, giant, not T-Rex himself, but T-Rex type big predators. And in this area of the world, there were, in theory, 3 of them, fossils found living at the same time, around 100 million years ago, to answer one of our questions here. And so how could there be, that's like having, 3 different types of predators on the African plains. You've got lions, that's all you need for a big predator. So the fact that Spinosaurus primarily hunted in the water, well, that makes tons of sense. That way you could have a top-notch predator. You could have lions in the plains and you can have the alligators that are the predators in the water. And so I like that just having a new fossil like this can actually explain part of the ecosystem. They can talk more about how all the animals in the area lived, not just Spinosaurus himself.
Yeah, for the longest time, it's just been, we know how this animal ate and moved and maybe a little bit more detail, but being able to fill in the details of what the world of the dinosaurs was like, how they interacted with each other and other animals. We had a couple questions come in, Becca. How big was the Spinosaurus and was it closely related to alligators and crocodiles?
Yeah, great questions. The Spinosaurus was actually huge, and I know those pictures make it out to seem kind of potentially small, but in reality, it was larger than a T-Rex. So it was a massive dinosaur, which is why also we didn't know too much about how it would move. And I guess it makes sense. Being big, it can move in the water. Doesn't have to exert as much energy if it's swimming, potentially. So that actually would make a lot of sense for it. And as far as the other question was, is it closely related to crocodiles and alligators? That is an excellent question. And it's one that I bet scientists are thinking about right now. For a long time, it was believed that it was closest related to something like a T-Rex or some sort of raptor. But now that we're sort of understanding that maybe it was a little bit less of a 2-legged dinosaur, more swimming, more sort of with paddle-like feet, kind of looking like a crocodile, it's possible that it may be reclassified at some point in the future. So it's one of the things that I'm sure scientists are currently thinking about right now.
All right, and we have time for probably just one more question on this one. how is it possible that this is the only swimming dinosaur we know of? Asks Jessica.
Also a great question, and I'm sure you may have heard of a few other swimming creatures during the time of the dinosaur, like the plesiosaur, the mosasaur, and the ichthyosaur, and those are all really large swimming reptiles. They're not classified as dinosaurs. It's kind of an interesting fine line between what is classified as a dinosaur and what is classified as a swimming reptile or a flying reptile or a reptile on land. But as of the classifications that stands right now, those specific reptiles that were swimming were not considered dinosaurs, but Spinosaurus is still considered to be a dinosaur. So right now it's the only one that we know of that did take advantage of swimming.
Okay, we're going to move on to our number 6 story, our last entry for today. It's in the domain of chemistry. So Susan, can you unzip our next story?
I should have said that my favorite thing about the top 10 are the puns that Eric comes with every year to introduce each story.
They are impressive.
So our number 6 story is about the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Now, every year there are 3 scientific Nobel Prizes awarded: chemistry, medicine and physiology, and physics. And they're obviously all huge, huge stories because they wouldn't have won the Nobel Prize otherwise. But oftentimes, or always, it's for something that was discovered many years, if not many decades ago. And it's just now, it's become, kind of part of all of science. And so we award the Nobel Prize for it. This one, the reason we included it this year is for several big reasons. One, it's from research that was done or only started being done in 2012 for the development of a method for genome editing called CRISPR. We'll talk more about CRISPR in just a minute. But the fact that it was just started, this research 8 years ago, is amazing. The other amazing thing is that it was won by 2 women. This is the first time 2 women have ever won a Nobel Prize in any science by themselves, with no men awarded at all. Emmanuelle Charpentier from Max Planck in Germany, and Jennifer Doudna from UC Berkeley in California. Now, they're only the 6th and 7th women ever to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And just some more facts and figures, only 4 women have ever won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and only 12 have ever won it in physiology or medicine. But a little bit more about this Nobel Prize itself and what CRISPR is. So acronym, kind of long and odd looking what it sounds like. You can ask questions about it later if you want. But basically, it's a very specific, easy, cheap way to change DNA, to target a piece of DNA. It uses something that actually comes from bacteria, a process from bacteria that specifically recognizes an area of DNA and causes that DNA to become cut. That's it. It's very targeted and it cuts in a very specific place. But once you cut open DNA, you can, that destroys that piece of DNA. You can cut it in multiple pieces and totally ruin a whole piece of DNA. You can put in a new piece of DNA. You can cut out a couple pieces of DNA so that you remove like a chunk, remove it, and put in a new chunk. And so this has almost unlimited application. Some really amazing applications, and I'll mention briefly the ethics in just a moment, but aside from that, the most amazing things it can do is things like increase crop production, make really important crops, wheat, rice, corn, maybe be immune to diseases or the pests. Some people are using it to create biofuels, using plants to create fuel, or having bacteria be able to create fuel or eat plastic. Being able to manipulate mosquitoes so that they can't carry diseases. The one that's down in the middle there is a picture of sickle cell anemia. And last year, sickle cell anemia became the first disease to be treated with CRISPR to try and fix a genetic mistake in someone's DNA. On the bottom there, that's a Tasmanian tiger, because CRISPR could potentially be used to bring back endangered or extinct species or to help save endangered species. And then finally, CRISPR is just an amazing tool. If you can cut, manipulate, or study DNA, we can learn about every single piece of DNA or gene that's out there. So it's an amazing tool for pure science research in and of itself.
Yeah, I think this was just a really exciting story for so many reasons for us that we kind of had it up on our board, and we've had other Nobel Prizes we've covered in years past, but we've covered so many CRISPR stories that already the applications are starting to be seen where it's being used in labs all around the world, that it was great to see that it was honored with a Nobel Prize, and pretty quickly too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be impossible to overstate the significance of CRISPR in biotechnology and just how much it's revolutionized the field. And that's why they won this within a decade instead of waiting decades like most Nobel Prize laureates. And it's because, you know, we've had methods of changing genes in organisms from the 1970s, but they have been clunky, they've been expensive. CRISPR is so easy that you can literally go on the internet right now and order your own CRISPR editing packet and do it in your kitchen at home. And so it has just completely changed the way that labs all across the world are beginning to think about and solve problems, as Susan mentioned, from biology to fuels to climate, all of these different things that can potentially be solved.
And the more women we see being awarded with Nobel Prizes, the more women will be considered for Nobel Prizes. Because for a time, the early 1900s, even mid 1900s, yes, there were less female scientists. But now there's just as many, or at least more proportionally than we're seeing these awards given to. So the more we see these awards given, the more women aspire to do the research that can potentially win these awards, and the more people think to award them to these women and notice them for these. So it's going to take some time, but hopefully we'll start to see over the coming years, which we have even in the past couple of years, of those 24 women that have won Nobel Prizes, almost half of them have been in the last decade. So we are seeing an increase in women winning Nobel Prizes in the sciences.
All right, we got one cool, interesting question here. Is it possible to see CRISPR in action with a microscope, or is it too small?
It's too small for the most part, but you can see its results in things in a microscope. So if you manipulate a cell, you can barely see a cell. You know, you can see a cell under a microscope. You can't see the DNA itself, but you can make changes that you can soon see underneath it. But no, unfortunately, we can't see it actually happening under a microscope. We can just use chemistry and biochemistry to understand what it is in fact doing.
Yeah, I would say stay tuned on that one. There are plenty of scientists out there right now who are trying to develop methods for viewing very, very tiny action within cells. So probably in the next 5 years, we'll have a top 10 story about being able to see CRISPR in action.
All right, well, before we wrap up today, I wanted to make sure we mentioned one cool thing that we've been looking at the Museum of Science, and that is that Massachusetts is going to be voting soon on a state dinosaur. Some legislation will be passed to introduce. We've never had a state dinosaur before. Some other states have it, but it's down to 2. We have a state representative who's going to bring legislation next month, Representative Lewis. And so you can find out all about it online. You can look up and find the poll very easily. You can vote on which dinosaur. You still have a couple weeks to do that. And then learn all about not only the dinosaurs we had right here in Massachusetts, but the legislative process as well. All right, that seems like a good time to cut for today's program. Be sure to tune in each Wednesday in January at this time as we reveal the rest of our picks for the top 10 science stories of 2020. Next week, we'll get to 5, 4, and 3, and we'll reveal number 2 and number 1 of the year in 2 weeks on January 27th. I'd like to thank my panelists and invite them to say goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in and asking such amazing questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't answer every single one. We've got lots of other digital content for you to enjoy, from other live streams to our podcast Pulsar that has a version of this top 10 list coming out next week. Follow us on social media or check out our website, mos.org/mosathome, to see what else we're up to. If you enjoyed today's presentation, please visit engage.mos.org/welcome to support MOS at Home. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.